Mark Regev, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
I'll come back to the hostages in a moment. I want to talk about Gaza first of all. Will Israel allow a humanitarian pause to allow more aid to reach civilians in Gaza?
Our policy is to pursue the campaign against Hamas relentlessly, not to let up, to destroy their terror machine, their military structure, and at the same time, in parallel, to do everything that we can to facilitate humanitarian aid for Gaza. We've been talking to the Americans, we've been talking to others about a humanitarian corridor from the south, from the Rafah crossing, from Sinai into Gaza, and to establish a safe area on the coast of the Gaza Strip where civilians can find a safer place to be until the crisis is over.
I appreciate that none of these things are straightforward. However, the situation in Gaza is in a severe crisis. According to the UN, people in their shelters are down to a litre of water a day. Even your staunchest allies, the US, are encouraging you to allow more aid in. What is holding it up? Why can't you make it happen?
Well, as you said in your question, it's not easy. But from our perspective, we've said as a government, we want no limitations whatsoever on water coming in, on foodstuffs, and on medicine.
And yet, sorry, Mark Regev, but there are limitations on those things now.
There are logistic limitations. We're hoping to overcome them. The first few days of the aid coming in has been like a pilot project to get the act together. Obviously, there are security concerns which cannot be ignored. Hamas, we don't want them smuggling in weapons in the aid. But I think we're moving forward, and I expect shortly that the amount of aid going into Gaza will actually reach a much higher level. That's our hope, and that's what we're working to achieve.
But is it good enough? I mean, this bombing campaign's been going on now for days and days and days. Your own military says they've dropped 7,000 strikes on Gaza. You knew what would happen as a result of those strikes. Why are you running a pilot program so late in that bombing campaign?
No, it's not just dependent on us. You need to have other actors also working together. The Egyptians are an important partner here. And of course, you don't want Hamas interfering with the aid coming in, as that is the fear of everybody. Aid that's destined to reach the Palestinian civilian population of Gaza has to reach civilians. If it's earmarked for civilians, it needs to reach civilians. We don't want it stolen by Hamas, as has happened in the past with fuel.
But right now, are you saying that it's Egypt that's holding up the delivery of more aid to Gaza?
I did not say that.
But you said it included Israel was part of the decision making to allow more aid.
Yes, definitely. We understand. Look, Hamas is our target. We will continue to hit Hamas hard. But we don't want to see unnecessary suffering amongst the Gaza civilian population. That's why we've asked people to leave the areas where we expect there to be heavy combat. We've asked them to relocate to the south. We're working with the international community to create there a special zone where people can be safer.
You appreciate that many people cannot leave northern Gaza, and there are people who've elected to stay to take care of civilians. But let's move on to the issue of the casualties.
Can I just say on that issue?
Please.
Can I just say on that issue? I'd like to say on that issue that it's true. We've asked people to relocate because to get out of a combat zone is common sense. Hamas, however, has demanded that people stay in the combat zone. Hamas has actually put up roadblocks and to prevent people physically from leaving. And it's clear why Hamas is doing that. They're saying so publicly. They want every last Gaza civilian to be a martyr for their crazy, extreme agenda. The most normal thing is for people to leave combat zones. That's what happened in Syria. That's what happens in the Ukraine. People should leave and find a safer place.
Now, Israel is accused of killing thousands of people in Gaza. Once the ground invasion begins, how do you prevent that number getting up to the 10,000 mark?
First of all, I urge you and everyone else to be very careful with the statistics that come out of Gaza, because all those, the numbers about casualties are all provided by a Hamas-controlled.
Yes, I didn't quote the exact number from Hamas. Nonetheless, you don't deny that it's in the thousands.
And the numbers that are coming out of Gaza, we have no idea how many are combatants, in other words, terrorists, and how many are civilians. We don't know those numbers. We do know for a fact that in that one isolated incident of the hospital, when they were accusing us incorrectly, of course, that it was Israel's responsibility, they said 800 people.
Yeah, well,
and of course, the number was nowhere near that. The number was nowhere near that.
Mark Regev, let's not get distracted by the hospital issue, because we know that there are, whatever the final number is, it is a very large number of civilian casualties. My question is,
it's nowhere near 800, and that's all I'm saying is they're exaggerating the numbers, Sarah. That's all I'm saying, and we have to be aware of that.
We are aware of that. I want to ask you what happens in the event of the ground invasion actually starting. What do you do if the civilian casualties reaches a much higher number? Let me put it in these terms. Is there a limit to what international law allows in terms of Israel's self-defense when it comes to a number of casualties?
Of course. Israel is trying to keep the number of civilian casualties to a minimum. I'd like to be able to tell you and the ABC that there won't be any civilian casualties at all, but obviously that's not realistic. There hasn't been a war in modern history where civilians haven't been caught up in the crossfire. But as a democratic society, and we don't target the Gaza civilian population, we'll do our best to minimize any civilian casualties. Hamas, on the other hand, does the exact opposite, as we've seen in the story which we've just spoken about telling people not to leave expected combat zones. But you have to understand, inside the Gaza Strip, Hamas's military machine is subterranean and it's buried under civilian neighborhoods. But we can't hit that machine effectively, without there being damage to civilian structures. And that's why we've asked people, please, for your own sake, relocate.
Is there a limit to what the world will put up with in terms of civilian casualties in Gaza once the ground invasion begins? Do you understand how you stop the Arab world in outrage? You stop this conflict spiraling further out of control?
So I'd like to say two things on that issue. Number one, I mean, if Israel wasn't concerned about civilian casualties in Gaza, we could just bomb all those underground facilities from the air and destroy them with massive bombing. And no, we're going to send our soldiers in very dangerous house-to-house fighting. And Hamas has got booby traps and tunnels and fortifications. It'd be much easier just to bomb and destroy from the air. We don't do that precisely because we don't want to see wholesale destruction of Gaza's civilian population, heaven forbid. We want them to leave the area, and we understand that not everyone can. We will make a maximum effort in the framework of difficult combat, once again, to keep civilian casualties as low as possible.
But you understand, I'm going to come in here. Yes, you understand that the goodwill that Israel felt after the savage attack on October the 7th, that goodwill will drain away if the civilian casualties continue to mount.
We want to keep the civilian casualties as low as possible. I repeat that.
Well, let's move on. Let's move on to the hostages. I don't want to make you retread. At the beginning of the conflict, Finance Minister Smotrich, a member of Israel's war cabinet, said that Netanyahu would have to sacrifice the hostages. Is that Israeli government policy?
A small correction. He's a member of the cabinet, but not of the war cabinet.
Thank you.
That's a much smaller group.
But a significant member of the cabinet, nonetheless. I apologise for that mistake. Is it Israeli government policy?
Israeli government policy is to, as I articulated, is to pursue very effectively and aggressively the war against Hamas, a war we didn't want, a war we didn't start, a war that was forced upon us, but we'll win it on our terms now. And at the same time, to do everything we can to bring the hostages home. That's one of our war aims. And we believe there's not necessarily a contradiction between those two goals, because Hamas isn't going to suddenly become a humanitarian organization. Hamas is not really, it doesn't care about the hostages. It sees them as pawns in a chess game.
Well, let me ask you,
a very brutal chess game.
Let me ask you about Hamas, because in his speech last night, Prime Minister Netanyahu said the goal of the war is to destroy Hamas militarily and its governing abilities. Who replaces Hamas to govern Gaza after this is over?
You're correct. The goal of the operation is to destroy the Hamas terrorist machine, their military structure, and to dismantle their political control of Gaza. We've had discussions with friends and allies, and of course internal discussions on what happens on the day after. I have to tell you, though, there are different scenarios. I can't go into details, but all those scenarios, some of them are not simple, but they're all preferable to continued Hamas control over Gaza. Because we saw what Hamas control over Gaza brings. It brings the sort of massacre that we saw on Saturday, October 7th. Well, there were people who were telling us, you can live next to Hamas, you can find a modus vivendi, that Hamas is slowly moderating, that the fact that it controls 2.3 million people in the Gaza Strip means it has to become more pragmatic. No, we saw Hamas's brutality firsthand on October 7th. This is not a moderate organization. We cannot live with Hamas, and the goal of our operation is to end this terrorist enclave on our southern frontier.
You just said,
to destroy it.
Yes,
that'll be good for the people of southern Israel. It's also good for the people of Gaza, who deserve better.
You just said that there have been discussions about what that could look like. Can we just have some idea about what you're talking about? Are we talking about the Palestinian Authority taking control of Gaza, or an international force, a UN force? What are you actually talking about in terms of the aftermath?
I understand the questions, and they're good questions. I'm not at liberty to go into any detail whatsoever. I apologize. I can only tell you that the different scenarios under discussion are surely preferable to the continuation of this terrorist base on our southern border. We refuse to live with the threat of terrorists, ISIS-type terrorists, on our southern border any longer.
Mark Regev, I hope you'll come back on for a further conversation on those topics, but thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. Much appreciated.